Hello, and welcome to our next chapter in our general chemistry class. So in chapter 8, we were looking at, in our previous chapter, how do atoms bond together? And so how do we know which atoms are bonded to each other, how many electrons are shared between them, and that sort of thing. So we were able to look at Lewis structures of something like carbon dioxide, like this, where we know that to complete the octet around each of the atoms in this structure, that we know that the formula is CO2, but what does this actually mean? How these atoms are bonded together? And we looked at this Lewis structure where we have a double bond between each carbon and the oxygen atoms next to it, and then lone pairs on those oxygen atoms. We could also look at something like methane, CH4. And if we draw the Lewis structure here, we end up with something like this, where we have a carbon in the middle and 4 hydrogen atoms surrounding it. Now, these Lewis structures are great for telling us how atoms come together to form molecules and how those molecules are connected to each other, how many electrons are being shared between the different atoms in the structure, but they don't tell us anything about how these molecules are actually shaped. And so the point of Chapter 9, our goal in Chapter 9, is to look at molecular geometry, or the shapes of molecules, and how we can understand how these two-dimensional flat drawings that we do with Lewis structures, how they actually translate into a three-dimensional space, right? So, a methane molecule does not actually look like this with 4 hydrogen atoms sort of at 90 degrees relative to each other, right? This is not what actually happens because methane does not exist on a piece of paper that's flat, right? It exists in space. And so that's the goal of this chapter, is to take these two-dimensional representations we have as Lewis structures and find out how do these actually look in three-dimensional space. What we'll learn is, for example, carbon dioxide does look like this. It is a linear molecule. So if we sort of ignore the lone pairs, right, carbon dioxide is a straight line. This is what we call linear. But CH4, methane, does not look like this. Instead, what we'll find out is that methane looks like this, where I'm trying to draw this in a two-dimensional piece of paper, but of course it's kind of hard to do so. But methane is this three-dimensional structure that looks like a pyramid. So if you sort of connect all the hydrogens, you get what's called a tetrahedron. And it's not this flat structure, but instead it's this pyramid-shaped structure. So this has what we call tetrahedral geometry. And we will learn how to figure this out as throughout the course of this chapter. And so why do we care? Well, the shapes of molecules affect their reactivity, their function, how they interact with other molecules. And so it's just as important to understand both how the molecules are attached to each other, like we do with Lewis structures, as it is to know, once we know how they're attached to each other, what shape do they actually form, because it has consequences as to how they behave, how they interact with light, and other things like that. This serves as our introduction to Chapter 9. In the next video, we'll start looking at what things we need to think about to be able to figure out geometries and shapes of molecules.